thank you for that, and would like to welcome all of you to Union Depot. It's always a pleasure for us to have different groups come and see the facility, and hopefully you'll find reason to come back for other meetings or events, or to take one of the transit providers that we have based out of here at this time. I'm going to try and go through kind of a brief high-level history for you of the Union Depot as a train station, talk a little bit about the renovation project that has occurred here, maybe spend a little bit more time on some of the challenges or lessons that we learned during the renovation project and perhaps even since it's been completed. Talk to you a little bit about the successes in terms of the transit operations that are now based out of Union Depot. I'll turn it over to Andy. He'll talk a bit about the long-term vision, future plans for the depot, as well as transit and the East Metro in general. We'll leave some time for questions and answers, and then anyone who is interested in going on a tour of the depot, there'll be a couple of us that be willing to take groups around to do that. Just before I dive into the history, I want to just make mention of a few materials that I put on a back table that are yours to take if you're interested at all. One is, we call it our historic brochure, but it's much information about the history, much more than I'll go into today. We've also got a brochure that talks about Lower Town. If you're not familiar with St. Paul or with this portion of St. Paul being Lower Town, just kind of gives you some ideas of what's near and available for you to do. We've got a Central Corridor Historic Properties map, just kind of talks about all of the historic properties that are along the Central Corridor. Again, if you do take the light rail or want to take it, it's got some good information about what you're seeing or going through on it. Got another little flyer which is really about Union Depot as an event space. I'm going to talk mostly about it as a transportation center, but this room, as well as several others, we have available for meetings. We have weddings, we have galas, we have had proms here. So if you're looking for a place to have a meeting or a social event, keep us in mind. There's also a pamphlet back there about public art. I'm not going to talk really at all about public art today, but if that's of interest to you, we have a pamphlet here that talks about the 10 different installations that were part of the renovation project here. So with that, I'm going to give you a little history lesson. I won't go into too much detail, but the building that we're in right now is not the original depot that was here in St. Paul. The actual original structure and tracks were all located south of Kellogg Boulevard, which means a little bit closer to the river. That original station and tracks all opened in 1881, really the peak growth time of railroading in the central part of the country. 9 different railroads operated out of there. They were all, if you will, busting at the seams, both for tracks, for passenger space, just all their maintenance operations, etc. But we kind of joke and say they couldn't really agree on what to do, how to expand. That station ultimately had 2 different fires in it. After the second fires, the 9 railroads decided it was time to do something different. They had tried on previous occasion to get the U.S. Corps of Engineers to reroute the Mississippi out here because the tracks kept flooding in the springs, and they weren't successful with that. So they figured they had to do something on their own. What they decided to do was create an elevated train platform, which is what you still see here today, to get the tracks up out of the water or out of the floodplain. They also needed more tracks. So they expanded that deck much further to the north, literally almost under our feet. And they also knew they needed a much larger train station. So in 1914, they commissioned the architect Charles Sumner Frost, who came on board and did several different versions of what he thought a train station or a depot should be. If any of you are familiar with him, his design is the neoclassic style. And as you approach the Union Depot or go through the Union Depot, that style is typical typically exhibited in the columns, the symmetry, the repeating patterns as you go through the building are all very much his style. It's the same style as he used the Jefferson Monument, so you can think of those big columns. They finally got going on construction in 1917. They did start, as this picture kind of depicts, with the front portion of the building, which is called the head house. It took them till 1923 to complete the head house and the first part of the concourse to the waiting room, which then allowed them to start servicing some amount of passengers out of the new station. They continued construction through the waiting room. Many of you may have come in that way, but the waiting room is what extends all the way closer to the river until 1926. When all was said and done, the waiting room is the length of a football field, and beneath that were 21 sets of tracks, all on that newly created train deck. Somewhat unfortunate for the passenger rail industry, really the peak of passenger travel was occurring in the 20s, right as the station was being completed. As we moved into the 30s and the 40s, passenger rail was very much declining. Here at Union Depot, they saw a little uptick in passenger counts during the 40s, during World War II, due to the number of military personnel. But at the conclusion of World War II, again, the passenger numbers rapidly declined. You think about the 50s and the 60s and everybody moving to suburbia, everybody having 2 cars, maybe more, and obviously a lot more travel by air. In 1971, the last passenger train left this Union Depot, and in fact, after that was closed to the public. One noteworthy point in history that probably was in good part the savior of this facility or of the structure of the head house is the fact that it was put on the National Register of Historic Places in 1974. Saved the building, but was no doubt an extreme burden to the person who bought the head house because it very much restricted what they could do with the head house. So from 1971 on, there were many different uses or attempted uses of space in the head house. I won't go into too many of those. The actual train deck and waiting room portion of the property was purchased by the U.S. Postal Service. Over all the years, the Postal Service operated out of the train station, much of the mail for many, many years was coming in and out by train. But they, in fact, bought the train deck area and continued to get mail in off the freight trains for a good number of years. And then as the mail started moving more by trucks and trailers, cabs, the U.S. Postal Service removed the track from the site and really converted the entire train deck to a loading dock, shipping and receiving for trucks, trailers, bringing the mail in and out that way. And the U.S. Postal Service operated here for many additional years. It was in the early 2000s that the Locate Task Force was created really to explore transportation in the future for the East Metro. It was that task force that recommended that Union Depot be reestablished as the transportation hub on East Metro. Their recommendation, some further studies, ultimately came into the Ramsey County Regional Railroad Authority deciding to purchase back what had been the Union Depot properties and really, if you will, put the depot back together again. This is a difficult drawing maybe to see, but the somewhat T-shaped building on the left side is of course the Union Depot with the head house and the waiting room. And then extending all the way to the east along Kellogg Boulevard is what is now the Union Depot, again putting it back to what it had been before. In 2010 is really when all of the design work was completed as far as the renovation and the new construction that would be required to reopen as a transit station or a transit hub. And the actual renovation project itself was completed between 2011 and 2012. As a historic property, the renovation had to follow the rules of many, many different historic groups, as well as follow the rules of all of the different agencies whom, in one way or another, provided grants or funding to the project. One of the first things that the historic groups had to determine is, okay, you're going to renovate, but renovate to what? You know, what's that magic year? What's that magic place in time? And they determined that the depot should be renovated to what it looked like in 1924. So what was that? Well, that's a whole other exercise in determining, you know, what was it all like in 1924. But in total, it's a 33-acre site, and we needed to look at all of that and determine what was needed, what it would be used for, and what sort of renovation was needed. The goal was for it to be a multimodal transportation hub. So what were those modes and how were we going to accommodate them on the property? It was determined that we would go with a design-build concept. As I mentioned, funding came from several different sources, federal, state, and local. I'll talk about that more in a minute. Again, as a historic building, we had to go through an extensive evaluation of the existing conditions. You know, what was structurally sound, what could be renovated, what maybe couldn't be or shouldn't be, as well as what should be new. Talked about the historic site and that application of the historic renovation rules to everything. The train deck itself, which again, if you've looked out the windows here, you'll see is a very large structure and had to be renovated. And again, historic preservation rules came into play at every turn. The funding for the project, again, came from a number of different sources. So we had to have staff that was involved in putting together applications for the various grant monies that became available. Some of the funding, particularly the Tiger grant money, was available with a very short time frame to begin spending and completing the projects. And that really was a driver in the short timeline for the project. What would typically have been probably a couple-year longer project than what this was able to be condensed into a shorter time period, that 2-year time period, by really attacking the project from all directions. There wasn't a let's do the roof first and then the inside. No, it was literally let's do everything that we can do at the same time to speed the process. The total dollars for the project, $243 million. Roughly just under $100 million was actually for the purchase of the various parcels of the property to create the 33 acres again. And then the other $144 million or so obviously involved in the renovation, the new construction, as well as the track and signal installation. A little bit about the historic process that was used. The contractor team that was key to the project was Mortensen. They were the design-build contractor, utilizing architecture and engineering services from HGA and from URS, or now AECOM. This is just a little depiction of all the different groups that get involved in a historic project, a preservation project. In order to keep everybody informed and up to speed and to able to timely decisions, they actually met every 3 weeks to go through every new item, every new area to determine what was going to be the agreed upon approach or for restoration or repair or replacement. There were also a lot of agencies and transit players involved in the project. This slide just identifies some of them, but there are three freight rails that utilize the tracks adjacent to the depot that had to be involved in the project. There was always the goal of having Amtrak come here. We had Metro Council working on the Green Line out front, even prior to the renovation here at the depot. You may or may not know this, but within the head house there are actually 39 condominium units. Those condominiums were occupied. Those folks lived here through the entire renovation project. We also had Christo's Restaurant operating within the head house during the renovation project. There was a period we did have to work with them and close them so that some work could be completed literally in their space. And all said and done, again, it was less than 2 years to complete the project. The grand opening was in December of 2012. At that time, we had Metro Transit operating several of the local Twin Cities bus lines out of the station. We had Jefferson Lines regional bus service on board from day one. We also very quickly had a couple of the casinos interested in running shuttle buses out of here, and that continues to today, being Mystic Lake and Treasure Island. They run free shuttles. And we also opened a bicycle storage locker facility that people can leave their bikes in, sign up for the month, and then also shower restroom facilities for their use. Then in 2014 is when we really took a big leap in the transportation world. We added regional bus service by Megabus and Greyhound lines. That's when Amtrak first operated the Empire Builder out of here in May. We added a couple of car sharing programs, Zipcar and Car2Go, and then the Green Line opening in June of 2014. Since then, 2015 and into 16, we've added a couple of different office tenants. We are just opening the Lowertown Bike Shop as of May 1st. Their actual grand opening is likely to be in June. They operate a retail and repair shop. We also have a bike trail that goes east-west across the entire property that we hope soon to be able to connect on the east side of the property to the other St. Paul trails, Bruce Bento and others. And we're out for the summer at least, we're going to be having Segway operate out of the Union Depot, running tours of St. Paul by Segway, much like they have been doing in Minneapolis. Some of the challenges and lessons learned along the way in this project, one big area had to do with the signalization of the tracks here at Union Depot. Originally, the tracks on property were to operate dark, meaning no need to signalize anything. Switching would all be done manually. Then as it came close to time for the construction of the tracks, there was a lot of publicity and pressure, I suppose, being put on the Federal Railroad Administration to do things to make tracks, trains safer. Was also the period of large volumes of oil moving by freight train, hence creating a lot of that publicity. So in our minds, at least a little bit at the last minute, the FRA came in and said that all the entrance and exit points to the property here needed to have signal control. And not only those on the property, but all of the switches in the immediate adjacent properties as well. Well, as I mentioned, we've got three freight railroads that operate, and they probably weren't all necessarily happy to understand that they now needed to put signals in, both east and west of the property. So we had to work with them really to redesign everything to get the switches, the signals all installed. That put a bit of a delay on the track and signal project, pushing it to being constructed throughout the winter of 2013-14. I don't know if any of you remember that winter, but it was extremely cold, and they're out there trying to put in track and signals in order to be ready for Amtrak's arrival in spring of 2014. As far as the building project itself, I think you can see from some of the slides I put up there, it was multiple agencies, transit, transportation, historic, in addition to all the normal building and construction groups to work with. The short timeline presented challenges, but at the same time it also motivated everybody to work together and to really solve the problems or solve the issues, keeping an eye on what's most important. Again, the historic building, every time we turn around or every time there was an unanticipated problem arise, you had to stop and see what were the ramifications there as far as the historic nature of the building. This project in total created about 4,400 jobs for the companies that were involved in the project at one time or another. And during the project, there were over 2,200 skilled tradespeople on property working. If you walked around, or if you do walk around, I mean, there's a lot of trades or crafts that are pretty hard to find these days. They had to be found and brought to work on this project. At the peak of the project, there were over 300 construction workers on site each day, all doing their part for the renovation. The train deck itself, if you think about it, having had 21 sets of tracks on it, potentially 21 trains sitting out there at any given time, you can realize that structurally it's very significant, yet it was in fairly bad shape. So there was nearly 800 of the structural support columns that had to be redone in order to maintain the integrity. Parking structure, we have parking, underneath the train deck itself, which we refer to as Lot B. We also have parking within the lower levels of the head house building we call Lot A. Again, in order to continue parking in those structures, they had to be proven to be sound to support that load. And in fact, very late in the game, the parking in Lot A was literally condemned, and that entire floor structural support for Lot A had to be redone. That occurred in 2013. As I mentioned with the train station, this having been a floodplain, during the renovation project, as well as in 2014, the year that we really opened for Amtrak and light rail, were years where there was some amount of flooding of the Mississippi River. Well, if you see any of those pictures that show flooding occurring in St. Paul, it's all happening right out here. Shepherd Road, Warner Road intersection right down by the river is the first thing that floods. And somewhat lost in the renovation project is the fact that when the waters reach a certain point, the city sets up a massive pumping station on Kellogg Boulevard right at the entry to our bus loop. So we were busy figuring out with the city how to reroute bus and car traffic in order for them to set up their pumping stations, which in effect keep this part of Lower Town from flooding if the water level gets up just a few more feet than what it did. So we had some early lessons in flood mitigation. Throughout the renovation project here and after, MnDOT, utilizing an easement on the property, was doing the Lafayette Bridge, which is the bridge you can see out the windows there. That caused us to delay completion of some of our surface parking lot area. We did what we could. We planned for the finishing, but that final parking lot construction couldn't be completed until late last year, 2015, when the Lafayette Bridge project was winding down. Lessons learned around concrete. I'm not sure that you ever learned the lesson, but we have a massive amount of concrete here, and between cracks and spalling and salt and everything else, we seem to just kind of go from one project around concrete to another. So if anyone's got any good tips there, we'd take them. As I mentioned, this train deck is, concrete structure above parking. So with parking beneath there, anytime we have a leak in the train deck, we're trying to chase it down to prevent that leakage from coming into the parked cars beneath. Retail spaces, there's not a lot of those in this building, but one of the lessons learned there is everyone was optimistic about what retail should occur in what spaces, and as a part of the renovation did do some amount of build out of those spaces. You can think build it and they'll come. Well, build it and if they don't like it, they won't come. So it was a real catch-22 about how much to do for retail spaces without having a specific tenant in mind. So we have had to do a redo a bit of things in order to attract some of the retail tenants. While we switch to Andy, it's not a lot in the Union Depot project about traffic, I guess. So I gotta find it. So I wanted to show you the one relocation on property that did occur that thankfully didn't have to go out onto the street. Oh, it won't come from there.
Doesn't, just. Okay. All right. Not right now. Yep. Okay. Thanks, Gene. And I'm going to switch gears a little bit and kind of talk about now that the depot is built and what's really the future plans for this facility and how it fits in to the rest of the city and the region and really the state. Just starting with what we do here at Ramsey County Regional Rail Authority and the overall county. One of the things you'll see is that, as a county in here, we're pretty densely, fully built out. We've got over 500,000 people. We're the second most populous county, but also the smallest county in the state. We've got a high percentage of people of color living in Ramsey County, and we also have a large percentage of transit-dependent populations that need a way to get around, which is where transit and providing transit service, which is one of the key missions of the Regional Rail Authority, becomes so important for what we do. And it really breaks down into a few key areas. One of those is preserving rail corridors for future use, whether that's for freight or for passenger rail or for a combination of both. We do own some property, most notably a corridor between here and about Maplewood Mall, where the Bruce Ventel Trail currently runs. We own that corridor and have reserved that for future transit. Gene had mentioned the depot, that we do own that as well, and are always looking for other opportunities in the future as they may come up. We also participate in other regional planning initiatives. The rail authority is often on these boards and commissions, along with the county public works having a separate seat at the table as well. And active collaboration with other partners out there. The map on the screen, this is from the county's Transit Improvement Board, and that is the quarter-cent sales tax for 5 of the 7 metro counties to help build out the region's transit system. And you'll see that, the lines on here, the ones that are colored are the ones that are built or the ones that are sort of close to being, or they're out of the planning stages. They're now moving into environmental and design. And you'll see the big UD sign and the big Target sign. This facility becomes one of those two regional hubs for where these lines start to feed in and starts to build an overall system. This is a snapshot looking to the west, and you'll see that's the Empire Builder train pulling in. You also see the green space and the other train decks there. There is room to grow at this facility as the regional, not only the regional transit system, but connections to other areas and other places throughout the Midwest, like more service to Chicago and things of that nature, which I'll touch on in a moment. So that's kind of was the concept of the depot. We sort of have all these things now. We have the intercity buses, we have the local buses all pulling in, we have the car share and car rental, we have the passenger rail with Amtrak and bike facilities with Lowtown Bikes coming in. But like I said, there's room to grow, and we're looking to the future to adding more and more levels of those services out of this facility. A couple of the projects that we are working on. First one is called the East Metro Rail Continuity Project. And this is sort of the outgrowth of a study that was done, led by Ramsey County with, Gene mentioned the 3 railroads that go through this area, Union Pacific, BNSF, and Canadian Pacific. An initial study, and this is really the follow-up work, was to look at there are a lot of different lines that come through this area. A lot of them come through Hoffman Junction just to the east and down in front of the depot. It's something about it's 5% of the nation's rail-based freight comes through this junction every day. So it's very well used, but just the nature of it has created somewhat of a bottleneck over the years, and there's been a couple of projects to kind of make that a little bit easier. And one of those is, if you're looking at, I have a pointer here, but if you see, there's sort of a track just south of the Union Depot that crosses over the Robert Street Bridge. When that train makes that movement, it really shuts down all the other freight lines in the area. It can cause up to a 45-minute delay. And when you're moving that much volume, that can be pretty substantial. So one of the projects out here is really that identified in the green, which is a new track to be laid through, which as part of it is a grade separated tunnel to give UP more of a dedicated track so it doesn't have those crossovers and shutdowns. And the reason that's important for the freights, but also important for Ramsey County and important for the region, is because by allowing the freights to move through here quicker, that can potentially free up some capacity for passenger rail projects. So more of this partnership opportunity, and that could be more capacity for the trains that are going to Chicago if more service is added in the future, or potentially one of the corridors I'll talk about in a moment, the Rush Line corridor that we're planning. One of the options could potentially co-locate with that new alignment and share it with a different type of train technology. The next project I wanted to touch on, and we've all sort of heard about some variations of this here today, is service between Chicago and St. Paul. And right now there is the Empire Builder train. It runs from Seattle to Chicago. It comes through here 8 in the morning if you're heading to Chicago. If you're going to get back, you're going to get back at about 10 at night. The on-time performance was a little bit dicey the last few years with the oil booms up there, but now that that's kind of slowed down, on-time performance has been great, so do come out and make the trip. But looking at ways to speed up that service, and many of you may recall a few years ago with 08, 09 with the American Recovery and Investment Act, there's a lot of energy behind high-speed rail, which is really kind of higher speed rail up to 110 miles an hour. So that's what this route is showing, and that's where this map had come from, and that was originally going to be 8 trains a day, both directions. That ended up not moving forward when Wisconsin decided not to participate any further in that planning. But what did move forward is more of I would say, an incremental approach to the service planning. So right now we are putting together a partnership agreement between MnDOT, WSDOT, and IDOT to do the environmental work for a second train between Chicago and Milwaukee with some capital improvements, but you do the extra train, whether that may be 1 train back and forth or 2 more trips, you start opening up a lot of different options for either making day trips or going one night and coming back the next. And you're not doing that whole leg all the way out to Seattle, so your reliability can be a lot quicker. So it's sort of a lower cost, sort of incremental investment that can happen, relatively quicker than the other options. And it's something that we're going to be starting the environmental work early next year to try to advance that, and that would bring the travel time down about an hour and a half total time between here and Chicago. So some improvements. It's not the true high-speed rail, but it does provide the additional option and more choices for moving around. The other projects I wanted to note on were our transitway projects that we're working on, and the reason that these 4 are highlighted and of significance is because they all would have stops or terminate at the Union Depot as part of them. And Ramsey County is involved in the planning for all of these lines. Some of them we are the lead agencies, and some of them other counties are the lead agencies. And that's probably something just to note for those who aren't familiar with the transitway planning process. This first phase pre-project development in our region, for all the transitway projects that have been done, it's been the counties, and really the counties working with the cities as the ones leading the initial effort. So doing the initial, looking at different alternatives to figuring out which is the best one, doing the environmental work to figuring out where the issues are. And that comes in this pre-project development phase. Once it gets into project development, we work a lot with MnDOT and Met Council and Metro Transit, but this is the point where the keys to the car get turned over to, for our light rail alliance has been Met Council to be the ones to lead the construction of it and Metro Transit to operate. So the corridors that I'll talk about in a moment are in various stages of this process. I guess all of them are really in the pre-project development where the counties are still leading them. And after that is project development. That's a phase that's defined by Federal Transit Administration. It's basically engineering until about 60% and getting your final environmental impact statement completed. And then typically another 2 years for final engineering, right-of-way acquisition, and then 3 to 4 years for construction. So that being said, a lot of these projects they're all still in that pre-project development phase, some a little bit farther than others. But a couple of them to note: Gateway Corridor, the Gold Line. This line extends from downtown St. Paul out to the Woodbury area. It's got about 12 stops. The one thing unique that's being looked at for here is bus rapid transit, which is it's like light rail transit, but it's operating on rubber tires instead of rail. It has all the other features: the frequent back and forth service, the nicer stations, the level or near level boarding, the unique branding, trying to help with the attractability of it. And in this case, it's looking at dedicated guideway, so operating in its own lane like light rail does, and not sharing the lane for the most part with other vehicles and mixed traffics. That helps with the speed. It also helps with the reliability. It also helps with creating a sense of permanence that's out there that you're seeing on these other lines that have helped to attract development around it. So of the projects I'm going to highlight, this one is the farthest along. It is just wrapping up its environmental impact statement by the end of the year. And I mentioned the mode is dedicated guideway BRT. The terminus spot will be the Union Depot, but since it's bus-based, it's basically going to come in on Kellogg and use the existing bus terminal to as its turning around point. The next corridor to highlight is the Riverview corridor, and what this corridor is looking at connecting is Union Depot to MSP Airport and the Mall of America. If you look at some of the earlier plans for a light rail system from the 90s, this idea of this completed triangle of the Hiawatha, the Central, back down the airport has always kind of been out there. And the corridor's been looked at a few times, and there are some challenges with some tight areas and what you can and cannot fit and how you go about doing it. But that's what we're looking at right now. Ramsey County is the lead on this study. It is, as of right now, all the technologies of the transit are on the table between bus rapid transit and streetcar, which is like a light rail, but it operates in mixed traffic with vehicles. And then diesel multiple unit is another one. That's a vehicle that we don't have operating in our region, but is in places like Dallas and Austin, Texas. And it's basically, it's a heavier, bigger light rail vehicle without the overhead wires. And it has advantages because it can operate on the same tracks as freight. So it can also be considered a small commuter rail. It's typically one or two cars long. So that's being looked at here. That's primarily along the Canadian Pacific spur track, but West 7th is also being looked at as another option for that route. Next corridor that Ramsey County is also leading is the Rush Line corridor, and this corridor extends from downtown St. Paul to Forest Lake, although our rail-based options are only being looked at to about downtown White Bear Lake and most likely be a bus-based after that. This study again is about that same phase as Riverview. It's completing up its pre-project development work. It hasn't started environmental yet. It is looking at that diesel multiple unit mode. I had mentioned that in that capacity slide, that could be a potential option for getting into downtown. I mentioned that the Ramsey County Rail Authority owns some track or some a former rail corridor or Bruce Mental Trail. We're looking at co-locating with the trail to get up to just north of Maplewood Mall, and then you would be on private freight or possibly on Highway 61 up to Wiper Lake. We're looking at that, but we're also looking at Wiper Avenue. Does it make more sense to be on that arterial street and sort of integrated with the fabric there, or does it make more sense to be sort of more separate on that trail corridor off with the more stations that are farther apart and quicker travel times? So that study again is still in this pre-project development phase, and most of these two projects are about 10 years old or so. Last project to highlight would be the Red Rock corridor, and this project, like Gateway, is being led by Washington County Regional Rail Authority. Since these projects don't end at the county lines, we work pretty closely with our partners to the east and even our partners to the south too, with Dakota County and to the west with Hennepin and Anoka. So we've got all of them. But in these corridors, we've sort of split that up that each of us becomes the lead on a particular one. So Red Rock is another one that Washington County is the lead on. And I think the biggest note on this corridor is it was originally looked at for commuter rail from Hastings into downtown St. Paul with connections to Minneapolis. But just with the volume of traffic on the freight tracks that we had found out from doing a lot of these other studies and actually talking to the railroads, you would have to do some major capital investments of building basically a whole new track to be able to do a rail option. And commuter rail is kind of a get them in the morning and out in the evening, which doesn't really match up with what people are wanting to do. It limits your amount of trips. More people have been shown to ride, the more frequent service and the more back and forth that you provide. So Red Rock has moved to, much like these other corridors, to more of a model that is providing that all-day type service. And the latest here would be bus rapid transit. There may be some components that are dedicated guideway, meaning having their own lane, but this would most likely be a hybrid where you have some nicer station improvements, but the bus rapid transit vehicle more operates in a highway type environment for much of the route. And it could actually co-locate with Gateway as it comes into downtown, since Gateway would be having its own dedicated guideway. That's one of the advantages, is that you could put more capacity in there from multiple lines if you build this road that's just for transit. And again, looking at that as a terminus at Union Depot as well. I think the last point I just wanted to mention on was that when we approach the transportation planning and transit, we're looking at it from the moving people perspective, but also meeting a lot of those other goals that the county and the region has set forward for economic competitiveness, for equitable access. And transit has really been seen as one of those key components. It's key for getting employees to work. It's key as a recruitment factor for people to come here for jobs, for employers to invest, and also for just the economic development. We've seen it on the Green Line, but even just if you're to come out of the building here and look around in Lower Town in the past 5 years and what's been going on since this building was renovated. There's a couple of the projects. There's next door, the U.S. Postal Building, 17-story buildings being renovated into apartments, and there's going to be a Hyatt Place Hotel. Sibley Square, an old former office building across the street. It's another conversion project that's going to convert office to 134 loft-style apartments with retail space. And also, the more people that are living in downtown and along the transit ways, this is resulting in an increase in office leasing activity and demand for retail as more people are starting to work and take transit to where they want to go. And really, the Union Depot then becomes kind of positioned as this transportation hub right in the center of it that can kind of help with the, you know, the economic development of, you know, of Lower Town, of St. Paul, but really our overall region. So with that, that was kind of the end of what we wanted to go through here with you, and Gene and I would be happy to answer any questions that you guys have here.
Okay, so can you comment on the current status of study for rail service?
Yeah, the rail service at Duluth project, the Northern Lights Express, that is continuing to move forward with environmental work. The route goes from Minneapolis to Duluth Superior. There's some questions about in Hinckley whether it diverts off the track to go more direct service to the casino, and then there's some work to get it from basically the top of the bluffs down into the actual city of Duluth. And I know that they had done some cost-cutting measures to bring the cost of that project down. But another key component too is just where the funding comes from, and that's going to be a major challenge for that project, is sort of piecing all those things together, federal, state, or whether the counties have a share of that. But not something that, since it doesn't go through Ramsey County Rail Authority, Ramsey County directly, we don't really have a big role in that one.
So you need
No, not at this point. I mean, it was looked at in the past. They've moved it in the direction of Minneapolis. The one thing that can provide is a pretty seamless rail connection between, now that we have the Green Line up in operation, between Minneapolis and St. Paul, and Minnesota Department, the DOT is looking at other, as part of their comprehensive rail plan, other connections throughout the state in the future. So thinking of connecting down to the Mankato area, how you connect to Rochester, how you connect out to St. Cloud, and even farther north to Moorhead. So I think as part of the grand scheme and bigger pictures, you know, as if there is more of an investment in passenger rail, it helps to sort of complete that system and allow for more trips and different types of trips for people to make. Sure.
So the line up to Chicago, you said that was running on the existing track, and you were going to put a parallel track on?
The one that runs to Chicago, the Amtrak, it wouldn't be a parallel. It wouldn't be a parallel track. I'd be using what's out there, maybe making some improvements along the way. A couple areas like putting a double track where there's a single track. My example of where you would have to build a separate track just for transit would be that Red Rock Corridor project when it was looked at for commuter rail. There just wasn't capacity through that area to start adding commuter trains, because those go in the morning and the afternoon. They essentially shut the whole system down. But if you're talking about just adding one or two trains, the freight network is able to kind of squeeze those into their system.
So ultimately, as a destination of Madison, Wisconsin, there's no plans to route through there currently?
Through downtown. Yeah, I think as part of the project that we're going to be working on and are working on, which is just to add that second train, I believe it's just going to follow the existing route with some more modest capital improvements at some places that need to be brought up to speed. I mean, but the long-term plan, there has been talks about whether that route should deviate and go directly into both downtown Madison and the airport, because right now it's like, I think it's like 25 miles north of Madison. Love this.
I think it's a show.
Yes.
All right, well, let's round of applause for Andy and Gene. We're going to have a tour now, about 45 minutes. Feel free to dip out if you need to. Throw some extra salad in your pockets because there's a lot left. And as a thank you, we have some super cool NCIT pine glasses for our speakers. With that, we'll take off about 2 minutes here.
Before we take off, just one other announcement. As is usually the case, we don't have section meetings during the summer, but we do have a summer social event planned once again for this year at Fritz Pub. Tuesday, July 27th. We had excellent weather and it's not a real stellar turnout last year, but those and I think pretty good spread of food as well. We're also working